ladies and gentlemen. You're welcome to the 2022 Annual Issuers Engagement Forum of NGX Regulation Limited, themed Climate Disclosures, Trends, Risk, and Prospects. As the world is evolving, investors and stakeholders globally are beginning to demand for more disclosure and accountability from companies. And this has required most companies to think beyond profitability and to start focusing on the impact that their businesses may have on society and communities that they operate in. This has given rise to the concept of ESG, environmental, social, and governance. However, a lot of attention has been on the social and governance aspects of ESG. With the rise in health concerns and the increased environmental threats such as floods, earthquakes, storms, as you can recall earlier in Lagos this year, we had a series of floods, and also Kogi State and some other states. So there's now a lot more demand for companies to start being transparent and disclosing on the impacts that their businesses could have on the environment and climate. And it is in this vein that the NGX Regulation Limited has organized this forum with invited guests and panelists who will be tasked with analyzing the theme and providing their perspectives on the issues relating to climate disclosures. To officially kickstart this event, I would like to invite the Chief Executive Officer, NGX Regulation Limited, Ms. Tinuade Awe, to give her opening remarks. Ms. Awe.
Thank you very much, Brenda. Good morning, good afternoon, or evening, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to welcome you all to this year's Issuers Engagement Forum. I would like to say a particular thank you to our regulator, that is ably represented here by Mr. Dayo Bisson, Commissioner for Operations at the SEC. As well as our other distinguished guests who are here, and to everyone in the audience who's taken time to come and spend this time with us on this very important issue. The theme of this year's forum, Climate Disclosures, Trends, Risks, and Prospects, has been carefully selected to pave way for robust discussions on the ecological challenges besieging our present world and the opportunities available in the face of the rising environmental threats to corporate existence. You will recall that discussions at the 2021 edition of the Annual Engagement Forum focused on environmental, social, and governance disclosures and sustainable finance. Building on this trajectory, NGX Regulation Limited has organized this 2022 forum to continue discussions on these burning issues that have speedily risen to the top of the agendas of corporate governance actors over the past decade. At NGX Regco, which is the independent regulatory arm of Nigerian Exchange Group PLC, we're committed to promoting a fair, transparent, and orderly market that thrives on full and timely information disclosure for the protection of investors in the Nigerian capital market. In this vein, in part 2 of this event, we will highlight certain compliance issues that we observed during the year under review, which we shall discuss with our listed companies. And because we're continually concerned about improving compliance, we shall also share some thoughts and insights on how our listed companies can navigate through these regulatory obligations in order to remove or reduce violations. Representatives of our listings regulation department will take our listed company representatives through these trends, as well as our regulatory projections for 2023. I wish to solicit the commitment of all the representatives of our listed companies present to help to build an efficient and sustainable capital market as stakeholders representing the interests of their respective organizations. Now, there are a myriad of issues to talk about this morning, beyond the issues we will talk about in part 2 of this event. And these issues are stemming from developments that have occurred in the ESG space since our last engagement session with you, ranging from the climate change crisis that continues to hit the world, to the war in Ukraine and the COVID-19 pandemic, which still persists in some parts of the world. The United Nations Sustainable Development Goals SDG 2022 report indicates that the convergence of increased fighting, the continuing COVID-19 pandemic, and the long-term climate crisis could push an additional 75 to 95 million people into extreme poverty this year compared to pre-pandemic projections, and that it could jeopardize the SDG blueprint for more resilient, peaceful, and equal societies. These projections are worrisome. Back home in Nigeria, we have witnessed our share of the combined impacts of these challenges amidst rising floods and food insecurity, and which have continued to impact the standard of living, especially for the most vulnerable in our society. While I will not delve into these issues, as they will be extensively discussed by the carefully selected speakers during the panel session, a report by The Guardian as recently as 22nd of November 2022 points to a looming food crisis as a result of the massive destruction to farmlands by the recent floods, which could throw 25.3 million people across 26 states and the Federal Capital Territory into acute food crisis between June and August 2023, unless the federal government and other government agencies, and dare I say the private sector, take drastic steps to mitigate the devastating ripple effects of such a potential national catastrophe on social and economic lives. Certainly, these unfortunate developments will require companies, not only in the agricultural sector, but in the entire corporate Nigeria, to reassess their contingency plans in the wake of these startling projections. On the positive side, it is gladdening to note that Nigeria is among the nations making strides in some of the positive developments that have occurred in the ESG space within the period, particularly actions taken by our regulators to drive sustainability and responsible climate action. The Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria announced its plan for early adoption of the International Sustainability Standards Board's IFRS Sustainability Disclosure Standards in Nigeria at COP27, which was held recently in Egypt. Also very recently, our sister company and the exchange on which our listed companies are listed, the Nigeria Exchange Limited, in collaboration with the International Finance Corporation, hosted a hybrid workshop on sustainable finance themed green and sustainability bonds in Nigeria. The primary aim of the workshop, which drew participants from a cross-section of society, was to promote and explore the opportunities in green, social, and sustainability finance as a vector for the development of the Nigerian capital market. Similarly, in October 2022, the apex regulator of the Nigerian capital market, the Securities and Exchange Commission, organized a webinar that featured distinguished industry leaders themed investor resilience and sustainable finance. These regulatory efforts point to the fact that business can no longer be conducted as usual and emphasize the need for issuers to embrace sustainable business practices and credible disclosures as mitigating measures against sustainability risks while positioning themselves to attract more investors and, critically, potentially unlock capital flows to the Nigerian capital market. As we look forward to the coming years with great expectations for a higher number of these kinds of programs, I urge you to avail yourselves of the opportunities presented by the various programs targeted at building capacity for corporate sustainability, ESG issues, climate action, and deepening the resilience of the capital market. I'm certain that our seasoned panelists and speakers, who are renowned professionals in their respective fields, are poised to lead these discussions, while I enjoin you all to participate actively so that we can have an engaging time during this event. I thank you, and I will hand over to Brenda. Thank you very much. Brenda, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Aware. And with that speech, the event is officially open. So up next is the goodwill message from the Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Mr. Lamido Yuguda, ably represented by Mr. Temidayo Obisa, Executive Commissioner in charge of operations at the SEC. Good morning, Mr. Obisa.
Good morning, and thank you very much for inviting the SEC to give a goodwill message. As I've been introduced, my name is Dayo Obiso, Commissioner Operations, and I'll give the goodwill message on behalf of Mr. Lamido Yuguda, who himself would have loved to be here, honestly, but unfortunately he's away at the moment and cannot be. In order not to hog the microphone for too long and make this a typical long-winded goodwill messages, not to make, okay, sorry, I got a bit confused by the screen. Not to make this a long-winded goodwill messages, I'll just paraphrase. A lot of the things that are contained in this goodwill message, they border on the things, some of the things Tino said. So I start. Good morning, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, distinguished participants, speakers. It gives me great pleasure to be invited to deliver this goodwill message on behalf of the Director General at the 2022 Issuance Engagement Forum, organized by NGX Regulation with the theme Climate Disclosure, Trends, Risks, and Prospects. In line with the objective of this program, it is expected that the engagement will stimulate healthy discussions between regulated entities and frontline regulators so as to share experiences and discuss global trends in the regulatory landscape. As the apex regulatory body of the Nigerian capital markets, the Commission supports all initiatives aimed at enhancing the development of the market. In particular, the Commission encourages stakeholder engagements like this one, with the clear objective of promoting a fair and transparent market, which ultimately impacts the development of the market. As you will agree, stakeholder engagements is an important tool through which regulators, market participants, and other relevant stakeholders interact and discuss pertinent regulatory issues and new developments impacting the market, all with the main aim and objective of promoting the development of the market. And this was particularly one of the reasons why the Commission on the 4th of August 2021 inaugurates the SEC/NECA, that's Securities and Exchange Commission/National Employees Consultative Association Securities Issuers Forum. So that means on the 4th of August 2021, we inaugurate the NECA Securities Issuers Forum. And among the mandates, so the forum had 3 key mandates. First was to maintain regular contact with regulators, SROs, and policymakers. 2, to advise policymakers and regulators on regulations affecting companies and to promote sound corporate governance and ethical conduct among issuers. 3, to promote healthy competitiveness among companies and maintain optimum business environment by monitoring all issues of direct relevance to business. As at date, engagement with NECA, Securities Issuers Forum, has facilitated several landmark developments. Please, you must pardon me. I'm starting to lose my voice, so please let me know when I become inaudible. Among the things that have been achieved was the suspension of the timeline complying with the guidelines of the implementation of Section 60 to 63 of the ISA up until December 2023. Then the suspension of proposed rule requiring public companies to report on penalties imposed on them in their financial reports. Then we made a submission to the Honorable Minister of Finance following the consultation between the two groups, Honorable Minister of Finance, Budget and National Planning, for further extension of tax waiver of bond transaction that is still being considered. Engagement with the CAC on recent regulations affecting capital market activities such as preemptive rights on issued or unallotted shares, prohibition of issuance of shares at a discount. Now that was paraphrased. The theme of this year's Issuers Forum, which is on climate disclosures, is a topical issue in today's financial and investment world, considering its impact in shaping investment decisions by many investors. Generally, corporate disclosures are essential and play a key role in enhancing the transparency of the operations and management of companies. And this assists investors in making informed investment decisions. It is in this regard that the Commission's regulations necessitate full and timely disclosure of all relevant information by public companies. One of the key corporate disclosures required by financial market regulators are climate-related issues, as there is no doubt that climate change presents financial risk to the global economy. Climate disclosures are important tools, as you will agree, which provide investors and other market participants with the information they need to manage risk and seize opportunities stemming from climate change. Financial market regulators require clear and comprehensive information on the impact of climate change, and this includes the risks and opportunities presented by rising temperatures, climate-related policy, and emerging technologies. The Commission recently issued reporting templates on sustainable finance principles for the Nigerian capital market, which requires regulated entities to render to the Commission periodic returns on environmental, social, and governance considerations, among others. That's ESG. Specifically, the principle relating to ESG requires regulated entities to innovate and implement measures that promote the good of the communities and the natural environment in which they operate. Some of the factors to be considered include efficient use of resources, such as energy or water, effective waste management, compliance with applicable labor and social standards, and alignment of the community development programs with Nigeria's overall goal for sustainable economic and social development. The main objective of the climate-related disclosures by companies to assist investors avoid companies that might pose a greater financial risk due to their environmental or other practices. As a regulator, the Commission will continue to promote good governance and policies that ensure and enhance investor confidence and the overall development of the capital market. On this note, I wish to thank again NGX Reg for putting this event together, and I wish everyone good deliberations, and we look forward keenly to the outcome of this deliberation. Thank you. Temidayo Oguso, on behalf of Lamido Juguda, Director General, SEC. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Except there are other things. I think I'm done.
Yes, sir. Thank you very much, sir. Thank you very much for your full message, and we appreciate the support of the SEC at this event. I would like to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Michael Ivensu, Special Advisor to the Director General, National Council on Climate Change, Dr. Salisu Dahiru. Sorry, Mr. Evans, so you're still muted.
Yeah, sorry about that. That was a technical glitch. Thank you, Brenda. Good morning, everyone, and thanks for having us with special greetings from Dr. Dahiru, who's currently out on a national assignment and has asked me to backstop for him. So specifically, my role in the council is on the energy and infrastructure policy advisory. As you well know, the National Council on Climate Change was established by the Act of Parliament and signed into law by Mr. President on November 2021. Basically, what informed that decision was to kind of harmonize the country's what we call climate action. Before now, climate action was fragmented and rather incoherent. But as we respond to the pressures of a changing world and the decarbonization across the globe, the Council now has been given the mandate under the law of the country to be able to provide some regulatory oversight on the different activities of the sector that involves emissions and involves any form of production. Now, specifically, the council's mandates under the law basically is to provide the regulations that supports our country's effort to decarbonize across all the sectors, meaning that these regulations also come with penalties. A typical one that is of note to most private sector is that the law now requires companies with a staff strength of 50 and above to have a climate desk or a sustainability desk that has responsibility for reporting back to the council on the entity's activities around its climate obligations, whether on the mitigation or on the adaptation side. That means that under the law, certain requirements for disclosures are now going to be part of our reporting obligations to government and, of course, to different regulatory entities around the country. Now, with specific examples or reasons for why we need to do this, typically, people would think about climate from the narrow prism of extreme weather events. But what we don't often discuss is the economic importance and the impacts of climate change. So typically, as a responsible member of the Committee of Nations, we are expected to participate and do our part in helping to meet the net zero target. But also, it's critical that we do this because the evolving regulatory framework with our trading partners is causing us to respond in a way that makes us uncompetitive. So, for example, for a fossil fuel dependent country like ours, our activities are now going to be subject to a lot of penalties by, for example, our trading partners in the global north. So a typical example would be the evolving regulation around the carbon border adjustments mechanism by the European Union that's going to kick off in 2026. That means every import that comes from Nigeria is going to be subject to some kind of a carbon tax. What that means is that it makes us uncompetitive. And that puts a lot of pressure on our economy and on our production capacity and our capacity to be competitive, in the global economy. Secondly, we look at the different areas that requires action from the country, not only on the oil and gas sector, as people would typically assume. We're also looking at the other sectors of the economy. So, for example, if our agricultural value chain is heavily carbonized, what that means is that our cashew, our palm kernel, our cocoa, our cotton will become increasingly subject to import taxes by our trading partners as well. And so it's important for us to begin to look at the economic dimensions of climate change and why it's important for us to actually decarbonize. One typical example that was given by someone speaking sometime during an event I attended recently. So he gave an example of a hypothetical case where the state of New York, for example, involves a legislation that forces Citibank to apply some kind of a penalty for US-based dollar transactions coming from countries like ours that are very, very heavily fossil dependent. So if our banking sector is still running on fossil fuel, then our dollar transactions are going to be subject to those taxes and or penalties, as it were. And that has a lot of impact on our ability to trade and our ability to be competitive as well. So it's important to be able to look at the broader dimension of climate, not just from a weather-related part, but also it's purely both an economic and a national security imperative. So from the perspective of the council, what we expect is that events like this and organizations such as the NGX and their partners, we're expecting a lot of support in terms of helping us to evolve our own internal regulations in the country, because we don't have all the answers. And therefore, we'll be relying on the industry and the expertise provided by the industry to be able to craft a fit-for-purpose regulation, whereby our disclosures not only serve the purpose to incentivize investments in clean energy and other low-carbon activities, but also to create an opportunity for us to diversify our economy and become more competitive. And then part of that is looking inwards into our own capacity to expand trading opportunities amongst the African countries using platforms like AFCTA, for example. And that in itself is a typical reaction or what we call climate response. And therefore, it's important for us to do this. So under the law, for example, the Climate Act stipulates penalties for non-compliance from companies and all forms of economic operator, whether they're private or public sector operators. And to that extent also, we are also providing incentives for people who comply. They're going to come in forms of probably tax incentives, but the regulation is not well formed yet. As you all know, the council is still new, and we're basically just starting to rev our engines. And I was chatting with Dr. Edozian earlier on, and I made it clear to her that that we're going to need a lot of help from the industry to be able to do this. The usual business as usual practice of government handing down things to the industry has to change. That means that the industry is going to be an active participant in helping to craft these regulations in a way that makes sense for all of us. And on a different side, it's important to also highlight what the federal government is doing in the areas of mainstreaming climate action into our national development plan. So the National Council on Climate Change is co-chairing an initiative under the technical support of the World Bank to the government of Nigeria, alongside the Ministry of Budget and National Planning and the Nigerian Bureau of Statistics. What this essentially means is that we are going to be looking at ways of building what we call ecosystem services into our system of national accounts. That means that we're going to be taking environment-related activities and putting them in a way that makes it possible for us to visualize our economy, not just from the productive sector, but what is the contribution of our ecosystem to the economy. And that is going to really change and help us reimagine how we visualize what we call assets and capitals and possibly liabilities. So for example, in this kind of framework, maybe your carbon footprint will now become a liability to you as a company. The more you pollute, the more you get taxed. And therefore, you are incentivized by governments to actually undertake and invest in activities that helps you reduce your carbon footprint. And we're also looking at the mandate under the acts for us to create a carbon market, which basically means that carbon is going to become a commodity, as it were. And in order to build a very robust and a very fair market, the carbon market is going to require the assurances and the MRV process around the integrity, market integrity, to ensure that we're doing the right thing and investors have confidence in what we're doing. And that is actually another role we think the private sector, especially the members here present, are going to play in helping us shape the evolving climate regulation. And to that extent, we are going to be engaging very strongly with the business community, with everyone here present. The FRCN, we expect to be coming to you at some point to begin this conversation in a much formal way, and then open up that to the rest of your clients and the people your clients represent. So for the purpose of helping to evangelize what the council is doing, I'll be quite delighted to share the actual Climate Act with this meeting, so that at your own quiet moments you can actually read and review it and fully understand what's coming down the pike and what the requirements for compliance is going to look like. Let me yield to Brenda and hopefully be able to provide additional clarification as we move forward. Thank you.
Thank you very, very much, sir. We appreciate your presence at this event. And as Mr. Evenso also mentioned, he did share some material with us, which will be circulating to all registered participants at the end of this event. So I would like to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Ndidi Noli Edozian, to give her keynote address. Good morning, ma'am.
Hi, morning. Technology issues never cease to fail us. Okay, just very quickly, it's a real pleasure to be here. Great to hear Tinu speak before. Great to listen to the words of not just the importance of the regulators like SEC, but also to know that FRCN is a member of the panel, as well as a number of colleagues of mine who I'm very glad to have here. I'm wondering if I can very quickly share a few slides, which I also want to make available to you. Can you see my screen?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Okay, I'll run through them very quickly because I know we don't have that much time, but I will also make them available so that they can be used. I'm very grateful to FRCN and NGX, Tinu and Dr. Anyara, both of whom are here, for joining the session last week, which was the session that the IFRS Foundation and the International Sustainability Standards Board organized ahead of its final board meeting of the year. In fact, that board meeting is ongoing right now. I think it's about 4 o'clock in the morning now, where I sit, hence the somewhat hazy light. And in that session, what we're trying to make sure is that really Nigeria's voice, and I'll explain to you why in a second, and Africa's voice in particular, is an important part of shaping these standards that are really going to be the global baseline for sustainability going forward. I think it's great news for Nigeria that the IFRS Foundation is the warehouse of these sustainability standards, because we're already very familiar with the accounting standards of the IFRS Foundation, which, as we know, is about creating global acceptability. Just to show you exactly where the ISSB sits, it sits right next to the International Accounting Standards Board. It's overseen by the IFRS Foundation trustees and the IFRS Foundation Monitoring Board, which includes IOSCO, which is the oversight body of the SEC in Nigeria. So very strongly connected with who we are and what we're familiar with. Idea is, what I'm trying to communicate is, yes, this is all new, but it's new for the whole world. Yes, this is coming, as we've heard from the previous speakers, and it will impact potentially capital flows, but everybody is learning and there's a huge opportunity to engage. Not just is there a huge opportunity to engage, but Nigeria, as a result of the engagement of the SEC, the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria, NGX, and 2 ministers in particular, the Minister of Finance, Budget and Planning at the African Ministers Forum, and the Minister of Industry, Trade and Investment, who oversees FRCN and gave his endorsement to FRCN to early adopt the ISSB standards. As a result of all of those activities, Nigeria is actually a step ahead. These are the ISSB milestones. ISSB, believe it or not, was created exactly a year ago at COP26. Since then, it's appointed a chair, it then appointed a vice chair, created exposure drafts. Again, here, I want to really call out FRCN and a number of the private sector parties in the room for actively participating even on those exposure drafts. Later on, you'll see that Africa's responses to comment letters are about 4%, maximum 6%. Nigeria has always had a strong voice in this regard, in the person of FRCN and NIRC, who have coordinated this. And I really am grateful for that, because it really strengthens my own voice on the board to have Nigeria's voice at the table, especially talking about the things that might be difficult to implement. I think that's really key, and I would like to thank you all for that and ask you to please not stop. Please continue. Why the ISSB? Well, as part of the IFRS Foundation and IASB, so accounting standards, are already deployed across 144 jurisdictions. The idea is really to develop standards that allow for a global baseline of sustainability disclosures and that have a connectivity with financial statements. because a lot of the time at the moment, sustainability kind of sits in a silo, or it has a department on its own. It's not necessarily mainstreamed across the organization. So the ISSB's objective is really to change that. Not just that, the ISSB's objective is to reduce the alphabet soup of standards. So these are a few of the standards: the integrated reporting framework, SASB standards, the CDSB, Climate Disclosure Standards Board, TCFD, have all been incorporated and consolidated into the IFRS Foundation, including also the World Economic Forum stakeholder capitalism metrics. So just very quickly, the board actually had its first complete board meeting 2 days ago on Monday. The 14th board member joined, so we now have a full board of the ISSB. We're working towards completing the standards, and they will be issued hopefully in the first half of 2023. At COP27, and again, congratulations to Nigeria, and thank you, FRCN, again, for your significant work in this regard. Not only did ISSB announce a partnership framework to support capacity building, especially in the Global South, with a special eye on Africa and on the African continent, and specifically on Nigeria, which was announced as a first mover on the adoption of these early adoption of the standards in early 2023, which means that we are really first in line for this capacity building support. I know I received the great news about Dangote being rated B on CDP, and CDP is actually incorporating the ISSB climate standards into the CDP criteria, so that it's actually already mainstreamed across 20,000 companies. The objective is to design these for communication to investors. You heard in previous speakers the threats to potential capital flows if there are no disclosures. I like to look at it from the other side. I think that if we take advantage of this, it will unlock additional capital flows. And not just will it unlock additional capital flows, it will actually help make businesses more resilient and more future-proof. If you think about it from a climate risk perspective, one of the physical risks that are affecting so many industries is flooding. If you're unaware of those climate-related risks, the impact on business and your ability to protect your business is significantly lower. So our objective is really to streamline or mainstream accounting standards and sustainability standards and financial statements and sustainability disclosures to prepare decision-useful information for investors. And we leverage a building block approach, which is how we call it. So you're very familiar with the financial reporting according to IFRS and of course other GAAP. There are also now the sustainability related financial disclosures that wrap around this. And these are being built so that they're interoperable with jurisdictional requirements that already exist, for example, on climate. Again, you heard that earlier, or perhaps you might have the existing stock exchange sustainability guidelines, which are very strongly built on GRI. The idea is interoperability. So there are ongoing conversations also with Europe and the ESRS and EFRAG to ensure that the ISSB standards align and are seamlessly interlockable with other standards, but most importantly, to create an alignment between the financial reporting or accounting standards of the IFRS Foundation and the sustainability-related financial disclosures, which from an IFRS or an ISSB point of view are very, very investor focused. I've thrown a few questions in terms of just thinking about this yourself. I'm going to run through these very quickly, but you will have the slides, and I'm happy to, do a more in-depth conversation at another point in time. But there are two standards right now. One is the general requirements standard for accountants in the room that is likened to IAS 1 and IAS 8. The idea there is to create consistency and connectivity with the financial statements that you're used to, so that we're using similar language as we're used to in terms of publishing financial statements to be able to create the sustainability disclosures, which ultimately will be published at the same time. So not a standalone sustainability report, but a report that is integrated with. There are 4 core pillars. There's governance, strategy, risk management, and then the targets and the metrics. So you can see it's very, very much business language, not outside of that. And the idea is to create consistency with the IFRS accounting standards. I mentioned already IAS 1 and IAS 8 as 2 of those. It's designed for the capital markets. So that's the reason why it's so exciting to be presenting here at NGX. Very, very critical stakeholder for us. And again, a few questions. Climate-related disclosure standards. What's very important here, and I was thinking about using a particular example of an entity to describe what metrics could be used and an entry point into that. Climate-related disclosure standards really focuses on 3 kinds of risk: physical, transition, and you can already hear today that there's a lot of regulatory change ongoing, and climate-related opportunities, for example, new technologies. Very, very important here is transition planning. One of the points that I will be making in the board meeting, not today, but tomorrow, and by the way, all the board meetings are public meetings, is the fact that we need to ensure that as investment and capitals flow, they're flowing also to invest in transition planning. So when we talk about net zero or GHG emissions and the disclosure of emissions, we need to ensure that it's not going to be a deterrent to a disclosure, but rather that we create a framework whereas investors are willing to invest in entities that are committed to transition. So the fact that you're disclosing your greenhouse gases does not mean you're a bad company, but rather that you're a transparent company and an accountable company that is aware of the need for transition planning and alignment with the global standards. Again, this is more information about the climate exposure draft. And the important thing to note here is that the TCFD framework and the SASB standards, which you may or may not be familiar with, are core aspects of the ISSB. I know this sounds very complex, so I've spent some time just essentially talking about the industry-based requirements, namely the SASB standards, which are being built into the ISSB. The objective of that is to ensure that there is an easy inroad into, and I'll talk about that in a minute, into the metrics that may be relevant and required for sustainability reporting. We have significant endorsement from IOSCO, and we're anticipating that once the standards have been released, IOSCO's endorsement will be a huge step in terms of not just increasing comparability, but also driving the mandatory and regulatory adoption of the ISSB standards. Specifically, the International Cooperation Forum and the meeting of African ministers earlier in the year in September pushed for early adoption. Our own Minister of Finance, Budget and Planning was present. And of course, also the Undersecretary of the General of the United Nations, who is also Nigerian. And the push there is for one, early adoption, simply because we think and believe it has the potential to attract more investment and boost private sector development. So we got a strong urging to provide capacity building support, which was what was then announced at COP27, which I mentioned earlier. The Bali Leaders Declaration, again, encouragement all across. Partnership framework capacity building. We'll be working closely with Nigerian stakeholders to develop, design, and deliver capacity building and advisory support. That's really key for us. Our commitment to an industry-based approach, permit me to speak a little bit about that. The idea is to create industry-based disclosures that are decision useful. So SASB standards have been embedded into S1 and S2. How does that work? You essentially have a sustainable industry classification system whereby, according to a broad range of industries, and also sometimes for conglomerates, a combination of industries, you are able to distill some of the key metrics. You can see here under environment, social capital, leadership, business model, and human capital, the universe of standards that have already been distilled. How is that done? there's a universe of 26 ESG issues, and these go through an extensive process to create the standards, which on average are 6 topics and 13 metrics. So the idea behind the industry standards is to actually make entry into ESG disclosures easier, not more difficult. That's what the SASB industry standards are for, because then you can pick up an industry standard for your industry and see what are likely to be material metrics and start with that, so that it is not it's not as overwhelming. That's the intention, because the S1 and the S2 standards do look very complex. They are not going to change that materially from what we issued as the exposure draft, but then on the other hand, they are going to change that materially. But everything is on the website. All the board papers are actually completely easy to access. One of the things I wanted to talk about here was, for instance, the idea is to build disclosure topic examples and find not just the sustainability impact, but directly all the way down to potential financial impacts. So to build the bridge between value drivers, what are the disclosure topics, the sustainability impact, and business performance, so that it's actually core to how you run your business going forward. There are a number of links. There are already guides, there are already courses, there's already, for example, the implementation primer is quite useful. And what I definitely wanted to say was to encourage responses, encourage engagement. It helps me if I receive comment letters, if I receive critical input, to hold a position in terms of how this looks from an investor perspective or from a preparer's perspective, particularly coming out of Nigeria, or generally in this case, you can see that Africa's response was 4%, of which Nigeria's response was significant. Closing out on this, I've already mentioned that we will issue the final standards as early as possible in 2023, definitely, or most hopefully in the first half. We're also working on a digital taxonomy, which should also help to simplify tagging and also reporting. Remember that the idea is for this to be cost-effective, decision useful, and market informed. What can you do beforehand? Evaluate your internal systems and processes, consider risks and opportunities associated with sustainability, and look at the proposed standards, look at the supporting materials, look at what is already available on the website, adopt these SASB standards, take a look at your own particular industry and look at what those metrics recommend, get familiar with the TCFD recommendations, but just remember that it's mainly those 4 pillars: governance strategy, risk management metrics, and targets. Take a look at CDSB guidance. That's now part of the body of knowledge of the ISSB standards. Drive connectivity through the integrated reporting framework. Again, for accountants in the room, we're working on aligning the management commentary, which was exposed, I think, in 2021, and the integrated reporting framework, which some organizations might already be familiar with, which also emphasizes very much the governance. What's important to mention to close is that there are monthly podcasts. They're just 2 minutes long that give you an overview. You can download the IFRS standards. In fact, you can download every single one of the 1,400 comment letters and read the feedback from different jurisdictions, which is guiding the way that the exposure drafts are being edited. You can observe the ISSB board meetings. There's one set of board meetings ongoing at the moment. They generally are monthly and for about a week, so 3 days during the week. You can download the board papers a week before the board meetings, and you can read the synopsis of the board decisions approximately a week afterwards. You can respond to live consultations, for example, in the digital taxonomy and on future exposure drafts that will come up. And of course, you can sign up for live alerts. And you can follow online so that you're the first in line to receive these. And with that, I think I am good. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much, Dr. Ndidi, for your keynote address. First of all, I would like to state that all presentations will be circulated to all participants at the end of the program. And just also highlights from what Dr. Ndidi presented, this highlights the need for companies to start assessing themselves and their readiness for the adoption and implementation of the ISB standards with regards to sustainability and climate-related disclosures. This also leads us to our next session, which is the panel discussion. And to moderate the panel discussion, I'll be inviting Mrs. Sophie Masipa, our moderator for today's panel. She will take charge and be responsible for introducing the other panelists. Sophie.
Thank you very much, Brenda. My name is Sophie Masipa, and I'm the CEO and founder of Muungano ESG. And this morning I have the task of moderating a panel, and I think that the conversations that the speakers that have already gone before us have really laid the foundation for our for the next half of of the sessions today. And thank you, Dr. Edozian, for that very robust presentation. So our panel will really aim to interrogate what this momentum means and how all stakeholders can prepare for better disclosure practices. The format is going to be 30 minutes in conversation with my esteemed panel, and then we will also invite the floor for another 15 minutes for a Q&A session. Can I say in advance, we have the Q&A button, so if you've got questions as we move along, it would be great if you load them in. I'm really, really excited and honored to be in conversation with this esteemed panel, who are no strangers to the conversations that we're having today. So to introduce them, I'm going to introduce Dr. Ihani Anyahara, who is the head and director of the Directorate of the Accounting Standards for Public Sector at the FRCN. He has over 3 decades of industry experience, of which more than 20 years have been in financial reporting and management, and accounting standards setting and financial reporting regulation. Our next speaker will be Mrs. Eunice Sampson, who's currently the Director, Climate Change, Sustainability Services at Ernst & Young West Africa. She is an award-winning sustainability professional with over 21 years of experience and has a certified management consultant. She's an expert in environmental and social risk management and supporting businesses across diverse sectors to effectively manage the risk and leverage opportunities presented by climate change. We then have Dr. Egazuma Okoroba, who is a sustainability expert with over 20 years of experience in the public sector, civil society, media, oil and gas, telecommunications, and manufacturing. She's currently, she joined the Dangote Cement in 2021 as head of sustainability, overseeing Dangote Cement's sustainability function, and she's an experienced developmental sociologist specializing in CSR, sustainability strategy, reporting, and climate action from diverse industries. And we're also joined by Mrs. Rukaya El-Rufai, who is the PwC Nigeria's lead on sustainability and climate change services and public sector assurance services. Her expertise in advising clients on sustainability strategy, climate change adaptation and mitigation, sustainability reporting, and climate financing and circular economy brings to bear her understanding of Nigeria's macroeconomic and microeconomic environments in a global sustainable development space. As you can see, we've got a great panel that's going to help us paint this picture and have a robust conversation. So to start off with, I'd like to ask Dr. Anyahara a question. The Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria recently moved to adopt the international standards, as we heard this morning, when they're issued in 23. I really want to ask what this practically means, and is corporate Nigeria ready, sir? Dr. Anyahara?
Thank you very much, Sophia, and thank everybody on this panel and on this call. Let me start by thanking the NGIs and especially the CEO Ms. Tunu Awe, who is doing a very good job. Sophia, your question is very direct. How ready are we, and what particularly does this early adoption mean? I think it means a lot to all of us in Nigeria, and I also want to use this opportunity to thank Dr. Ndidi for pushing us so hard, and also the Financial Reporting Council for seeing very far for this exercise. The announcement has placed Nigeria on a very, very significant or a lot of benefits on the adoption of international sustainability standards. And this has made it practically possible for Nigeria, like Dr. Ndidi mentioned, to be first considered for capacity building for implementation of sustainability standard. Again, we looked at it already. We didn't just make an announcement because we want to make an announcement. We have an experience on how to work with relevant stakeholders to make it happen. So the move is to work with professional accounting organizations, ministries, regulators, so that we can actually be on the same page, so that we can develop a strategy to raise awareness, to engage the stakeholders around the standards, and also develop a roadmap for timely implementation of the standard. We cannot wait for the standard to be issued before we commence. So that's why once you make the announcement, you have committed yourself and the jurisdiction towards a seamless adoption of the standards. So FRS's plan is to get our jurisdiction ready in terms of awareness, in terms of training, in terms of strategies, etc., so as to ensure that as soon as it is practicable, Nigeria will adopt the sustainability standard as issued by ISB. Nigeria will be seen as one of the very few countries that adopt the IFRS S1 and S2, and the corporate Nigeria readiness will, of course, be harnessed by few of these exercises we are doing. And that's why I'm so particularly happy that NGS has taken the first shot. And I know subsequently Financial Reporting Council and other regulators will be meeting in a no distant future to announce the roadmap and how to seamlessly adopt the International Sustainability Standard Boards S1 and S2. Thank you.
Thank you. I wanted to ask, I want to bring in Mrs. Eunice Sampson now. Mrs. Sampson, Dr. Anyahara has touched on the preparedness from his end. So how do we determine the oversight on the company side? And from a management perspective, who has this oversight and responsibility for these climate-related risks and opportunities? And what can companies do to ensure that there's proper governing policies and procedures in place?
Okay, thank you very much, Sophie. Before I go any further, it is important to stress that with the advent of climate change, it will no longer be business as usual. The way we treat natural capital, the way we manage our business communities, the way businesses relate with the larger society and key stakeholders would change, and is actually already changing. And this change is inevitable because human beings are highly dynamic and adaptive. And since we are now aware of the catastrophic threats that the changing climate potentially poses to us, our businesses, our investments, and even our future generations, it is only a fair expectation that we do all that we can to rise up to the occasion, pool all required resources, skills, competencies, and technologies together to confront this, challenge and with the intention of winning. And that said, it is also important to stress that we will not win this climate hurdle by denying that it exists, by attempting to wish it away using diverse conspiracy theories, or by pushing our today's responsibilities to future generations. So that said, talking about regulatory commitments, there are quite a number of them out there right now. We have the NDCs made as part of the Paris Agreement. We have the President's 2016 net zero commitment made as COP26. And of course, you know, the new Climate Change Act, which promises to be a game changer. And very recently, the commitment made by the Financial Reporting Council of Nigeria at COP27 in Egypt, that Nigeria would be one of the first countries in the Global South to adopt the new IFRS Sustainability Reporting Standard. And Dr. Ayahara and Dr. Ndidi have already spoken a lot about this. Now, our focus should be on addressing our level of readiness to support the actualization of these national commitments and regulations. On the ISSB reporting standard, for example, what do we now need to be doing differently to meet the requirements? From my own perspective, I think we need to go back to the basics and understand what climate change really is and how exactly it potentially impacts us and our businesses, and how our businesses also negatively impact climate change, because it's a two-way thing. And then we would expect the board of directors and executive management of businesses to take the driver's seat, support a robust climate risk assessment and mitigation strategy, draw up an implementation plan and roadmap, and put necessary mechanisms in place to drive effective implementation of the objectives that have been set. And it is also important to set KPIs, put incentives in place to encourage robust implementation, and sanctions in place also to deter inappropriate practices. And then there's a need to draw up a climate performance monitoring, measurement, and disclosure framework, and create robust awareness across the enterprise value chain, and also build the required skills and competencies, collaborate and leverage existing resources as may be necessary, and very, very importantly, develop a very robust and interactive climate data management system, without which it will be near impossible to accurately assess, measure, report, actual climate performance. And the board should also ensure that, the management of climate-related risks and opportunities, has clearly defined governance structure. To do this, they must themselves upskill and develop the competencies required to oversee and make informed, climate decisions, and develop climate-centric products and services, where necessary, and also make climate-sensitive investments. When the board and management is fully aware of their material climate risks and opportunities and how best to manage them, then the battle is, as good as half won. And this is why at EY, as part of our advisory on climate action, we always, recommend that board and executive management training should form the basis.
Thank you for that. Miss, I think one of the key things is we cannot have this conversation without a private sector engagement. So I want to bring in Dr. Igazuma Okoroba here. Investors and stakeholders, asking for more standard disclosures. We've heard over and over again that actually this could be a good thing for businesses. And we've seen that Dangote Cement PLC has been at the forefront of reporting and disclosures, recently seeing their ratings upgrade from CDP from C to B. So clearly there's value to reporting. What can other companies learn from you?
Well, thank you, Sophie, for highlighting that. Really nice to be on this panel. Thanks, NGX Regulation and all the panelists. This is such a huge opportunity to share and to learn. Like Ms. Eunice talked about, the fact that climate risks and opportunities are here to stay, and this is just a fantastic forum to share on this. So it is a fact that disclosing on climate change has seen the most changes in 2022, this year precisely. even before COP, the disclosures went all over the place. And for instance, you referenced CDP. We've moved from a C rating to a B minus, and recently we have upgraded in our rankings again. So what have we learned about this process? It's a whopping 130 questions in the CDP that you have to answer on climate change. And so companies cannot escape this anymore. You can no longer push this to the back burner. And the critical issues that are increasing the questions and disclosures on climate change are issues of governance, strategy, emissions inventory, and energy. So for a leading company like Dangote, for instance, the key lessons have been to address all of these three simultaneously and not leaving one for another. So just 4 learning points that we can share immediately is that climate governance has to be institutionalized. And this means that the leadership at the executive level really need to set that tone at the top. And like Ms. Eunice said about training and building capacity for the board and executive level, there's no better time than now to begin to upskill the board. We've also learned that disclosing emissions actually helps you to refine your CO2 reduction strategy. So some companies might think that this is a bit of, admitting vulnerability or perhaps too much exposure, but it's such an incredible opportunity to reduce your CO2 because you learn opportunities, and we've seen how it aids operational efficiency. It teaches you about technologies that you can adopt. We've experienced cost savings from our alternative fuel integration. And we've also seen the competitive advantage it gives us as a leading company in Africa. But my advice specifically would be to look at sector-specific performances. For Dangote Cement, for instance, we are members of the Global Cement and Concrete Association. This is an organization that aids us in metrics. We see what other companies in our field are doing around the world, and we're able to benchmark, learn technologies and different innovations that we can integrate. And this is something companies can do. Thirdly, biodiversity has become an integral part of climate change reporting, and this wasn't so before. So if you're reporting climate action and you're not paying attention to natural capital resources, especially as it has to do with land use, you have to think about the whole value chain of biodiversity, because this has potential to disrupt supply chain. It can cause conflicts in your communities. It can also disrupt the availability of raw materials. So biodiversity has become a key part of climate disclosures. And finally, adopting ESG metrics and targets on material topics is very important. For us, integrating or mainstreaming sustainability in the business has been, a huge win, because we do not isolate sustainability from other functions of the business. Rather, we integrate ESG into finance, into HR, into procurement, into every department, and everybody now can speak the ESG language. And this is really how disclosure becomes easier, because there is ownership, across operations.
Thanks so much. We've really heard kind of this this common thread coming from yourself, from Eunice, around measuring, around efficiencies. So I wanted to ask Mrs. Rukai El-Rufai, how do we verify these climate metrics? And do you believe that there should be standardization across these measures? Especially when, I'm hearing Igazuma speak about sector-specific standards. And I also wanted to ask at the third level, if we can briefly touch on this confusion that exists within the disclosure space around standardization versus taxonomy.
Okay, thank you and good morning. I won't repeat same appreciation and everything, so permit me to stand on all existing established protocols and appreciation to the organizers of the event. So very interesting and technical question. First of all, I would like to start by talking about what climate metrics are, why they exist, and what makes it verifiable before I go into discussing the standardization and whether it's standard versus taxonomy. So metrics simply exist to help us quantify and compare climate impacts of various emissions, right? And they're used to quantify contributions to climate change emissions, and they're also used to act as exchange rates, right? We heard the essay to DG for climate change, where it's even becoming a matter of trade. Price on carbon is real. You know, the markets, you know, what we're seeing is a public good now having liabilities attached to it and price attached to it. So no more tragedy of the commons, because even when you look at COP27 and the discussion of loss and damages, there is accountability to even past emissions, you know, in regards to the proportion of contributions that will be made to loss and damages. So, but the thing is, you know, TCFD has outlined 4 major characteristics of of climate metrics. It should be useful for decision making. It should be clear and understandable. It should be reliable, verifiable, objective, and consistent over time. So, you know, it does help, like Eunice and Dr. mentioned, for it helps with governance, strategy, risk management, and there are different types of metrics, right? But what would make it verifiable is being clear on the types of measurement to use. You may have to use direct measures, you may have to make estimates, use proxies. BlackRock was using proxies, but it keeps improving. Like Dr. Ndidi mentioned, it's an evolving landscape, right? The methodologies as well, the criteria, the data sources, all those make it, you know, verifiable. The trend, you know, and how the results connect with business units as well, the value chains, the connections with value chains, and how it's affected over time by climate-related risks, both physical and transition, and then how it reconciles with financial standards. So once you have all these clear, where you made assumptions, you're clear with them, you know, of course, you know, your metrics will be verified. Now move to the next of the question. Do I believe there should be a standardization, a standardized way of establishing the global baseline? There is the quest for the global baseline. There has to be a standardization for the trade to happen. We heard about the cross-border adjustment mechanisms. You just can't escape it. It has to be apple for apples and pear for pears, right? And in terms of the confusion for the taxonomy versus standards, taxonomy helps with the classification and the criteria, right? And, you know, beyond even taxonomy standards, you have protocols, you have principles, you have directives. So the way the standards have an apple, so also are the guidelines and the frameworks available. So for me, I think, you know, that's why for us in PwC, the way we start is by helping clients define the ambition. And it's vis-a-vis your reporting needs, your stakeholder expectations, the kind of risks and opportunities, and you have to mix. So you have to use greenhouse gas protocol to measure. You have to use TCFD, IFRS, SASB to disclose. You have to conform to EU directives and the taxonomy, and if it's sustainable. So it all you know depends. So I'll pause here in the interest of time, and I'm happy to address any question anybody might have.
Thank you. I wanted to bring Dr. Anyahara again and just ask him a question around, you know, it's so pleasing to see the regulatory space and environment, especially through the FRCN, really setting the tone for movement. What I wanted to ask is the question around enforcement versus encouraging adoption. So I wanted to understand, is this going to be is there going to be enforcement, or are we just encouraging industry to kind of adopt following the announcement? The second, and then overlaid onto that, is how will we evaluate these commitments that we've made?
Yeah, Sophie, thank you for that wonderful and critical question on all the issues. Yeah, once our regulators are on the same page, the issue of encouragement will be drastically downplayed. And of course, what is presently happening is, there are many forms of sustainability reporting going on. And when people talk about some of these things, I ponder and ask, what is it so this thing? If you look at the corporate governance code issued by the Financial Reporting Council, most of the issues we are talking hinge on the ESG. But when we are talking about sustainability reporting, most of us center more on climate change only. The holistic is talking about environment, social, and governance, which most organizations are currently reporting. So what the ISSB, IFRS S1 and S2 is doing is giving a single set of high quality sustainability standard globally. And if you have this single set high quality sustainability standard globally, it makes sense that all of us should be on the same page. Therefore, I see that when we are ready, like I said, the experience we have from transiting from Statement of Accounting Standards to International Financial Reporting Standards, we will replicate that experience and probably do the best to ensure that when the real time is on, everybody ought to have adopted, implemented. So for me, it will not be voluntary. And that's why we're working so hard to get involved, all regulatory bodies to be on the same page and to understand our mandates. Regulators, of course, I stand to be corrected in Nigeria. Most of us go beyond our remit. Most of the primary regulators are prudential guidelines, but issues relating to financial reporting, the Act makes it exclusive purview of FRC, and we have never done that without carrying the entire stakeholders along, including the regulators, and this is what we plan. So for me, it is not, it's not going to be encouragement. It will be what we expect. I wouldn't want to talk about sanction. There is always a moratorium. Our own issue is to get credible reporting. It is when entities insist on not doing what they ought to do that, of course, you have to make them to do what they ought to do, and that is where sanction comes in. Your question, I don't know whether I've gotten the other one is, I didn't get the last part of it, really. Evaluate, sorry.
Evaluation.
How will I evaluate? I had already mentioned at the initial part. One is doable. Two is something we don't have much option unless we don't want flow of capital to Nigeria, which we desire most. And three, it is what we ought to do. So the evaluation is that we will do the best we can to get all Nigerians to do what we ought to do. So I'm evaluating that it is the best thing we have done for Nigeria. You can ask Dr. Ndidi, you can ask even other African countries. Thank God Mr. Way is on call. The meeting we had on Friday, the Latin America, Asia, and Africa, when the guy from Zimbabwe spoke, they are looking up to Nigeria to lead African session for this. And Nigeria has provided that leadership, and I evaluate that it is good for not only Nigeria, but also for the entire Africa, and particularly for corporate Nigeria. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Nyahara. So just on the last question, I'm very happy that Ms. Ndidi is still here. So after the set of questions, I'm going to bring her back in so that there's no panic around the technical jargon that we're using today. We want to aim to cover a stream of topics and thematic themes. So I will bring her in later around the taxonomy conversation. But I wanted to bring Dr. Egazuma now and speak really around the role of cross-functional team support. How can business We've been speaking about better upskilling and equipping boards to deal with this education and information flow around ESG topics, climate, and the growing trends. But effectively, how can we do this?
Well, I can't say enough about, the power of collaboration. That's what makes sustainability just really interesting. And it's not that we are jack of all trades and master of none, but we're just able to plug into every function and find a strategy, that works for the present and the future generation. So basically for us at Dangote, functional collaboration has been the key. And what we do basically is through having one-on-one engagements, understanding the KPIs and deliverables, the needs of each functions, and then finding ways, to align this with our ambition with regards to climate change. ESG right now is such a broad range of topics that it's actually easy to lose the essence of the impact. If your MRV system doesn't plug into the KPIs of certain functions, but when you have engineers, finance people, HR people, technical people, instrumentation officers, all on the same table, sometimes you find that there's a diversity of interest. There might be disagreements around the topics. For instance, take child labor, the perspectives are different, but it's always good to have the separate conversations with a separate department. And then finally, there is an alignment on what the target should be. So Dangote Cement, we do have ESG targets on environmental topics, social topics, and governance topics. And we integrate functions that are not even seen to be social. When you engage an engineer on alternative fuels, for instance, and he begins to see that you can create green jobs from alternative fuel, he's not only looking at the calorific value of biomass or something, you're telling him how communities can actually transform by making money, creating wealth out of biomass. It gives them greater value. They have greater value in the technical jobs that they are doing. So this is how cross-functional collaboration really, really helps us. On the other side, you talked about boards. So what we do with boards is that we create these opportunities, quarterly reports where we have discussions with our boards, but critically, we need to give boards something they can work with. If you did the CDP reporting last year, you would observe that board competence on climate change is one of the new questions that were asked, and this wasn't in CDP before. So it's critical for companies to make sure that their boards are upskilled. And I would suggest a practical way to do this is to provide a toolkit. So you might have seminars, you might have trainings, but ultimately having a simple toolkit, that board members can refer to, and having a special committee out of the board, a special committee just for sustainability. In Dangote Cement, we have the sustainability and technical committee of the board, and they can look more critically at the climate change and sustainability issues. So this is the toolkit is one of the ways that you can keep your board upskilled and abreast with what the trends that are going on in the industry, and ultimately they give you the push, the drive, and you get that tone at the top to drive your ambition.
Thank you. I'm going to switch one of my questions around so that I bring in Ms. El-Rufai just before I bring back Dr. Edozian. But before I do that, I wanted to speak to you again, Ms. Sampson, around as the disclosure landscape increases, what do you believe is the impact of this regulatory monitoring context on greenwashing? Do more stringent climate-related regulations decrease the probability of companies engaging in greenwashing?
Sophie, is that for me?
Yes, Eunice.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. I mean, the topic of greenwashing is always an interesting one. There are still several organizations out there that want to look climate compliant and climate pretty on paper without necessarily taking the required climate actions. And this is one of the factors inhibiting the acceleration of good climate practices not just in our country, Nigeria, but in several other parts of the world. A number of major companies around the world today publish very well-written, well-laid out sustainability reports annually, but some of them do not even have as much as a sustainability desk, nor a trained and experienced head of sustainability in place. Neither do they have, the most basic sustainability policies and frameworks in place. Some of them, may not even have a clearly defined social investment strategy, let alone, a climate adaptation plan. So in such instances, greenwashing becomes inevitable. I mean, if you have no plan, you have no implementation structure, no ESG performance enhancement roadmap in place, then you have nothing to report. And if you have nothing to report, then the temptation to just tick the box or greenwash is very, very strong. Especially so if, such entities believe that they can easily get away with doing so, since there are no regulatory watchdogs overseeing these inappropriate reporting practices. This is why reporting in line with stringent regulatory standards is, in my opinion, the way to go. Considering how important the issue of climate mitigation has become, I mean, considering the climate-induced disasters that we're already struggling with in Nigeria and several other parts of the world, unprecedented flooding, extreme weather conditions, and so on, I believe that climate disclosure in terms of, the efforts that major organizations are making to address climate change and reduce, their own negative climate footprints should not be, discretionary. It should be mandatory because too much is really at stake. And it is through, factual, verifiable, and reliable disclosures that we are able to determine, track, and measure the actual progress that humanity is collectively making, in the plan to keep global temperature within the 1.5 degrees, Celsius mark. And so if climate disclosure is not made mandatory, and if disclosures are not stringently monitored for reliability and accountability, then we just might be moving around in cycles, a typical instance of motion without movement. And if that happens, humanity could be faced with a major crisis, one that just might be bigger for us, to handle. In addition to this, there should be comparability in climate disclosures, very, very important. To ensure that every organization discloses within clearly defined metrics in line with their materiality, of course, and also within a standardized framework. In this context, it is easy to compare an apple with an apple and an orange with an orange. And so actual performance can be, objectively determined. For example, in the world of financial reporting, this has been achieved to a very, very large extent. Yes, there are still loopholes here and there, but at least significant progress has been made because financial reporting is regulation driven. And there are clearly defined sanctions when sharp practices are discovered. So every major business clearly understands the rules of engagement when it comes to financial reporting. And I think this is, this should be the same path that we should be taking with climate and other sustainability disclosures.
Thank you. That really makes sense. So to bring in Rukaya here, I want to have a conversation around technology, and the ways we can use technology to fast track adoption, transparency, especially that we're seeing this growth in on-demand reporting using automation, and what are some of the impediments to climate risk assessments?
Okay. I mean, it's definitely tech-enabled. Everything is about technology now. Climate tech is huge. We're seeing how unicorns are propping up, just around climate tech. I mean, Doctor earlier made a very important statement on the relationship between climate and nature, and even nature-based technology as well. So technology would definitely help. In the first instance, like you mentioned, automation will help with efficiency and effectiveness. It would assure data and guarantee data. On a macro level, it will help with the governance and regulation If you look at UK, for example, they have an interactive map where you go, the large corporates report to them, and on real time, you can see the interactive map and see the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions, for example. Of course, that requires some imperatives like a national emissions factor. You have, technology can help you with performance management because you're following the metrics, because you're tracking the metrics, for value creation, to create value, to protect from value erosion, to harness fully the risks and opportunities of whatever material areas you've prioritized. Then, of course, it helps with the reporting and measurement as well. Insights and analytics for decision-making. BlackRock, for example, they use satellite image to assess physical risks of investments they want to make from climate risks. So, it does help. But what's very important is Scope 3. Scope 3, which is the emissions from the value chain. Technology can help you with traceability, where we saw the scandal of double counting with carbon credits, and just even traceability and being able to trace your entire carbon footprint. And of course, it would support platforms and the ecosystems. So technology is very important.
Sorry, Antonia, can you please mute your, Antonia, please mute your, thank you. Okay. Apologies, Rukaya, please continue.
Okay, so let me, on an end note, with the challenges, which is the other leg of the question, is first, data. I mean, data is always a challenge. I mean, you're as good as your data. The other challenge I see is willingness to invest. It's expensive. I remember just recently at our leaders dialogue where people that lead the alliance and partnerships we have with the OEMs, the likes of SAP, Salesforce. One company, a large conglomerate, might even need all the tools out there to be able to effectively measure, their carbon emissions and manage it. So it's an expensive venture, and I see many times clients want to report, they want to listen, but they're not willing to invest in the data governance management systems and the technology platforms. So this just can't be a back burner, and companies will have to put aside sufficient budgets, and invest in non-financial data the way they invest in financial data. So thank you.
Thank you so much. At this stage, I really would like to bring Dr. Edozian back into to kind of join our panel and really pick up on the last question that I raised to Kaya around this confusion around this taxonomy and standardization. Dr. Edozian, if you're still here, please come through.
Can you hear
and
me?
at this stage, sorry, before you answer that question, can I also ask the floor to send in their questions on the Q&A, because I'm going to open it to the floor after Dr. Edozian's intervention.
Thanks very much, Sophie, for a very interesting panel. It's been great. It's not lost on me that, a lot of the strong and very insightful voices around the room are female. And Dr. Anihara, I've long considered an honorary feminine Amazonian warrior in the best of every sense. So, what I always say is that the strongest women that I know are African and Nigerian in particular. And I use that as my entry point into talking about the fact that S1 is on general sustainability guidelines, and S2, as we call the climate-related disclosures, which has dominated this discussion, is on climate-related risk. We're currently in the process of, and I say this also to encourage feedback. One of the board papers we will take this week is on what do we focus on next. Top of the list, of course, is biodiversity, and that, of course, includes indigenous communities that protect biodiversity. It also includes themes like water, which are a huge risk to contend with. But it also includes the other themes are human resources, human capital rather, and human rights. And what's really important to state regarding the taxonomy. So on the future consultations, I really encourage participation and getting involved and reading these documents and giving your input. Because if 4% of the perspectives that are being considered in the development of the standards are African, then 4% is the weighting of that voice. So the more engagement that there is, the more that this perspective filters through. We talked about scope 3. So I've been one of the voices on the board that has talked about the challenges of data availability and data quality, especially on scope 3, and bearing in mind that scope 3 requires us also to involve smaller entities. Rukaya talked about the cost and the burden of reporting. So one big theme with the ISSB at the IFRS Foundation is proportionality and scalability, and ensuring that these standards are a truly global baseline that are also applicable for smaller entities, not just large listed companies, but also smaller entities. Because like it or not, so Europe is making mandatory scope 3, which means anybody who's supplying anything to Europe is obliged to report according to the European standards. And so we are working very hard to ensure interoperability with the European standards and also to simplify. So for example, with scope 3, the use of estimates is very possible, so that estimates can be made permissible and that allows for disclosures on data. And until there are tiers of reporting. I think on the accounting standards, they call theirs the IFRS for SMEs. In our instance, it's really to create standards that can be applied as a truly global baseline for all. So proportionality and scalability is really key. Comparability, let me land there, and how that relates to the digital taxonomy. So in the next year, in 2023, there will be an exposure draft on the digital taxonomy. And that really is also to enhance taxonomy and also retrievability of the data, because the whole essence of doing the work that we're doing at the moment is to ensure that sustainability becomes decision useful for investors and can help with investor decision-making and the direction of capital flows. And so a taxonomy that is going to be evolved will be published as an exposure draft. It will be made available to the public, and there will be a public consultation which everyone can participate in. I would love to see those numbers move up from 4% on the African continent, so that we have more of a voice in the shaping of these standards, which are as much ours as they are anyone else's. I really think it's an opportunity to also ensure that we have standards that are applicable. And of course, capacity building and advisory support, which is committed to the FRCN, will hopefully and definitely help that process.
Thank you so much. I think that's very important. And I think the line that I take from you and I find really important is, how do African companies, countries help shape the standard space? I have a question for Dr. Okoroba, but I think she's just left. Is Dr. Okoroba still here? If there's a question on the floor, around functional collaboration. So the speaker, the question asks, please provide more clarification on the deliverable KPIs. Is Dr. Okoroba still with us? I thought I saw her leave. If not, Rukaya or, oh, there she is. Let me get her to. Dr. Okoroba, there's a flow from the question, there's a question from the floor that says, you talked on functional collaboration. Please provide more clarification on the deliverable KPIs. And with that, I'm opening the floor.
Right. Okay. So the way that has worked for us is that we have our ESG material topics already, which we established through materiality assessment program. And at the end of a program, each function can take the topics that are relevant to them and make it their individual KPI or team KPIs. So our heads, our leaders know that during assessments, they're looking at those KPIs that reflect the ESG targets. So if you need cross-functional ownership of ESG issues, you need to think about integrating it in individual staff KPIs and also team KPIs for the year. And this would be the basis for quarterly, mid-year, or full-year performance reporting, basically. And of course, you can also think about incentivizing functions to take ownership and deliver or surpass those targets.
Thank you. I have another question, and I think either Rukaya or Eunice could take this one. So the question asks, which disclosures are some of the most important for companies, and is there any overlap? For example, if a company submits a TCFD index, does it need to submit a GRI index?
Okay, let me take that. I think disclosures are driven by materiality. So we have different, players in different sectors. You have the oil and gas, you have the education players, you have the agri players. These are all different sectors. And when we are talking about even climate change or taking climate action, the materiality, the climate issues that are material to one might not be material to the other. And even if they are, the extent to which they are material could differ. And so when you talk about disclosures, you have to be very careful that you do not take the approach of the one cap fits all. You have to be sure about issues that are material to you as an organization, as an institution. And to be able to do that effectively, you need to be able to engage your stakeholders and get their perspectives. And you also need to revalidate, whatever feedback you get. And that will determine the disclosures that you make. And of course, when it comes to disclosures, there are also aspects there are some indicators that are industry specific. So long as you play within that sector, you must report on those indicators. And yes, there could be overlaps, but what we usually advise companies to do at EY is to ensure that they align their priorities with the provisions of the key principles and standards. We are talking about TCFD, we are talking about ISSB, talking about the UN, UNGC, sustainability principles, and so many other commitments that companies have. So you have to find a way to align your own sustainability priorities and pillars with those major global principles and standards. And of course, it's also a question of which of these standards are you committed to, depending on where you play and what your stakeholders see to be material to your business.
Okay.
So sorry, Rukaya, I wanted to add one as you pick up on the last question is there is another question that I was going to pose to you from the floor, which is I would like to get an insight on the role of financial institutions and climate disclosures. So as you add on from what Eunice said, please also pick up on this question.
Okay. You know, like Dr. Ndidi said, the reporting landscape is an alphabet soup, and the honest truth is typically you might have to prepare an integrated report that speaks to different standards. And like Eunice mentioned, it's about your stakeholders. It's about the landscaping, the insights you get, because you need to benchmark, you need to look at the risks and opportunities, you look at stakeholder expectations, then what's material to you. But it's also important to know the difference between these two standards. TCFD is investor focused, and it focuses on the financial implication of climate risks vis-a-vis certain pillars, right? So that's purely, it's right now the only standard that helps harmonize financial with non-financial. Then GRI is multi-stakeholder led. You can either do a comprehensive, and then another important distinction is, you know, the way you do the materiality for these two. With TCFD is about financial implication, how material is it to enterprise value. With GRI, you know, you go with the double materiality. So that's why that starting point, before even you go into the materiality assessment, where you identify the metrics, you have to map your ambition. You have to understand what your stakeholders and users of that information, what they're looking for to prioritize. Then now moving to role of financial institutions in carbon measurement. Is it carbon reporting? Climate reporting?
Climate disclosures, yeah.
Very important. It's so funny that the most financial service-based, they would say, oh, but we don't have a direct contribution to the disclosures. You do. What are you financing if you're a provider for capital? What projects? What's the carbon intensity of your loan book? You know, how exposed are your collateral to you know, climate risks, even physical risks, you know, so transition risks as well. So you have to look at it from the how you have to report as a financial institution. You have to report the risks and opportunities for you. You have to report how you're managing risks. You know, how have you integrated it to your lending process? How are you trying to maximize the impact, the positive ones, and minimize the reduced ones? What kind of exposures? Not like insurance companies, for example, reinsurance of fossil fuel project is becoming an issue for them. So what kind of gaps are you getting vis-a-vis the global interplay and then the local maturity? For example, in Africa, we're still quite fossil fuel. Gas is still recognized as a transition fuel now. You know, what sort of risks do you sit on? Then that financed emissions is very important. Your scope 3 is what you're financing. So that's the role for financial institution to a large extent. Thanks
for that. Igazuma, I wanted to bring you back, and which follows essentially the last question that came from the floor. As a follow-on is, on board competence, also throw more light on how to get the board for active participation on sustainability reporting.
Right, so we know that it's actually beyond sustainability reporting. It's also about the actions that drive the company to reach its ambition. So if we're going to the board for budget approvals, and then we want to link our non-financial reporting to financial reporting, we know that climate action requires money. There are CapEx considerations, there are OpEx considerations to make. And if you have to get approval from the board for these expenses, how are you going to do that if the board doesn't understand the importance of climate change, if the board doesn't endorse or even, you know, empower executive management to drive the kinds of ambition? How do you pledge to decarbonize or to reduce CO2 emissions if your board doesn't understand how this is is going to impact enterprise value and also contribute to sustainable development. I mean, these are the reasons why you cannot take the board away from climate issues. And this is why a lot of the reporting frameworks are requiring a sustainability desk at executive management level. And now it has gone a notch higher, requiring the board to have that. So how do we achieve that? Every opportunity that the executive management has with the board. So the first step is to have a desk, like Eunice mentioned. When you have a desk, you can pool the material topics together and escalate this to executive management, and executive management escalates this to the board. And that's where you have a tune at the top that can sanction budgets, that can endorse ambitions. So every opportunity that you have to meet with the board is an opportunity for you to sell the trends in companies, what peer organizations are doing on climate change, and what the business can do.
Thanks for that. I mean, honestly, I could have this conversation all day. I really could, but we've almost run out of time. Before I get out, before I round up, sorry, Dr. Anyahara, I was about to bring you in. Did you want to say something? But I'd like to, before I round up, if it can be short, so I can just start using up the time that I have.
Yeah, so sorry, I understand anyways, I'm engaging that everybody would want to continue. Actually, on board competency, I appreciate Dr. Ijegoma's contribution. Again, permit me to make reference to Corporate Governance Code. There is this demand requirement for board induction, for regular board training. And where you have regular board training, I think the issue of this climate change, the risk, the transition risk, the fiscal risk should be brought up to their knowledge, not only to their knowledge, that they should be made to understand it properly, and that will guide them towards taking action. This is purely something like an integrated thinking where the whole book is not just reporting. You report the actions you took, not just the washing. So I sincerely appreciate what she said, and it means there should be concerted effort to mount training for board members on this particular area, so that they should be on the same page. I felt I should just pump in and just make this. Doc, thanks for that. Thank you.
Thank you, Doctor.
Giving me the opportunity. Yeah.
Thanks, Dr. Anyahara. And before you go, so you have exactly, pretend I'm at the Oscars at 1 minute, I'm going to cut you off. So for 1 minute, as a wrap up, I wanted all the panelists to answer this last question. And I'm going to start with you, Dr. Anyahara. When you look back in the next 10 years, what will success look like in your area of focus?
Next 10 years, I will look back and say, thank God, FRC took this decisive step to lead Nigeria into a mandatory sustainability reporting.
Thank you. Igazuma?
Right. So in the next 10 years, I think we're going to have a better informed stakeholders and communities. For us at Dangote Cement, it's really about a self-sustained Africa. So we look forward to our communities owning the narrative around biodiversity, natural capital, understanding what emissions are like and what can be done to address deforestation and issues like that. So I know that I believe that in the next 10 years, we'd have, such enlightened stakeholders.
Eunice?
Okay, so for me, success 10 years from now would mean, more businesses being more aware of and voluntarily adopting leading environmental, social, and governance practice. Not because, regulation mandates them to, but because they fully understand the risks and opportunities that their actions or inaction could mean for their businesses, the larger society, and of course, posterity.
Thank you. And Rukaya?
Yes, for me, in 10 years, I would love to see success is Africa being able to leapfrog, transition justly with a better world, with better social outcomes, better planet, stronger institutions, better economies that are more inclusive and present better living standards for Africans with sustained outcomes. I'd really love to see Africa keen and leading in future value chains because the world is changing. So I'd love to see us adapted fully to it. Thank you.
Thank you. I've been so inspired by today's conversation, and I can't thank the NGX regulatory enough for putting together this panel, putting together this esteemed panel of speakers. I've, listening to Dr. Edozian earlier on, listening to all the speakers, and I wanted to thank NGX for affording me the opportunity to really guide this discussion, and I hope it's not the last. And I know that as we move into 2023, there's going to be a lot of industry conversation and to get us ready and all the companies ready. And what I'd like to see, obviously, in 10 years is, the question I ask on enforceability is that enforceability and encouragement, and like all speakers, really seeing companies take active participation in that. And importantly, as a narrator and storyteller around the sustainability space, I'd like to see a message and a story told of Africa that has done and moved into the disclosure space in its own way, taking into account the environmental spaces and the environment and the landscapes that we live in. And I think Dr. Edozian wants to add her view on her I guess, success in 10 years, Dr. Edozian.
Yeah, no, sorry, but I absolutely, I must just add that, because you see, a lot of the time we talk about only the risks. I really want to underscore the opportunities. The opportunities of better governance, more transparency, more accountability, of more efficient processes, of using data that we're collecting in order to build more resilient businesses that are taking advantage of this, what seems like a challenge or seems like a hurdle, but if we're really able to embrace it, and this is the reason why I want to praise the regulators in the room and the corporate entities in the room that have said, we're going to look at this, also the consulting firms in the room. And Sophie, thank you so much for your facilitation. And I love the storytelling. I love the narrative. Let's take this narrative and let's look at it as an opportunity to unlock capital flows, not just to large companies, but also to smaller entities, which create the bulk of the jobs in our countries, because this is not just about Nigeria, it's about the region, and that create opportunities. Circular economy is one way of turning the climate scenario around so that we're opening the door, because we have so many bright young minds and there's so much potential for innovation. Sorry, I've taken more than a minute, but I just wanted to make sure that we're looking at the opportunity side, the opportunity to unlock capital flows, and that we are ahead. We're ahead. And I can't tell you how proud I am every time that the ISSB board members reference Nigeria and reference the African continent, because it's all positive, positive, positive. So in 10 years' time, when I look back, I just want to see a winner. I want to see more capital flowing onto the continent, and I want to see us leading this initiative, because we have carbon sinks. It's not just we are the least emitter in the world. 3% is what Africa emits. So let's find the opportunities. Let's embrace this with both arms. I'm here for you. Thank you very much, Sophia. I really appreciate this.
Thank you. And that's from me, 3 cheers to leading, 3 cheers to winning, 3 cheers to collaboration. And I look forward to more conversations with you. And this is back to you, Brenda.
Thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all our panelists. This has been a very engaging session. And before we conclude on this part, I would just like to notify all our issuers on the call not to drop off, that we still have a second session where we'll be discussing compliance issues around listed company. But once again, thank you, Sophie, and thank you to all our panelists. I would like to invite the head of Listings Regulation Department, NGX Regulation Limited, to give a vote of thanks.
Okay, thank you, Brenda, for this opportunity. I want to first and foremost thank the Almighty God for making it possible for every one of us on this call to be here today and to be a part of this program. Having said that, I want to especially thank the Director General of the Securities and Exchange Commission, Mr. Lamido Yuguda, ably represented by Mr. Timidayo Bison, for making out time to be with us throughout this program. We sincerely appreciate your presence. I also want to thank the Director General of the National Council on Climate Change, Dr. Salisu Dairo, ably represented by the Senior Special Advisor to the DG, Mr. Michael Inversor. I also want to thank most sincerely Dr. Ndidunoli Duzian, our own expert to the International Sustainability Standard Board, for staying up early this morning despite the harsh weather condition in your place to be a part of this. We appreciate you and we are not taking this for granted. And for the moderator of today's session, Ms. Sophie Masipa, we also want to say a very thank you. And to the four panelists, starting from Ms. Rukia Helufai, Ms. Unisamsi, Dr. Gezuma Okoroba, and Dr. Nyanya Hara, we want to say thank you for your time, for the insight you provided into the topic of today. We are very much grateful. I also want to thank all my team members from Listings Regulation Department for the work you put together to make this day a success. And for every participant on this call today, we are most grateful for making out your time to join us. Last but not the least on my list of vote of thanks is to my own very oga, the CEO of NGX Regulation Limited, Ms. Tinu Adeawe, for your leadership, for guidance, for all the push to ensure that the team delivered on this. So I want to say thank you so much for always being there to guide us and to do what we are doing at NGX Regulation Limited. A big thank you to everyone once again. As we move into the part two, as Brenda has already said, we want to please ask the issuers to remain on the call as we move into issues that affect us in terms of compliance and our plans for 2023. Thank you so much, everyone. Brenda.
Thank you, Godstein.